It's episode number 62, Saturday, September 5th, 2020. Episode 62, the HSA Tax Bomb. This is the 39.6 Facebook Live Finance Show, the show that teaches high earners like yourself how to make your money work for you so you don't have to work for your money. We talk general investing, taxes, retirement accounts, real estate, Airbnb syndications, and even the car you drive. This question comes from our Facebook group from Vera. Our Facebook group, 39.6 communities, up to 459 members. Please invite a friend. Help us hit 500. Vera asks, I love the tax benefits of an HSA account, but I just learned that in case of death, it only continues to be non-taxable if a beneficiary is your spouse. If a beneficiary is a non-spouse, then it becomes a regular taxable account. Is there a way to protect it from taxation and still pass it on to the kids? All right, if you're out there and you can hear, please let me know to make sure the audio and the video are intact and working before I finish another whole episode without it. Okay, so let's just first talk about an HSA. HSA is a health savings account, and you need to have a high deductible health plan in order to have an HSA. This is not to be confused with a health saving or health reimbursement account or flexible spending account. This is a health savings account, which is a completely different vehicle from those. You need to have a high deductible health plan. Now, you're allowed to put in a certain amount of money per year. Okay, let's just say it's $5,000 per year. That amount of money can go into the account, and it goes in pre-everything. Okay, so you don't pay federal tax, state tax, you don't pay Medicare, you don't pay Social Security on this. So it is super pre-tax, okay, because it's like a healthcare benefit. It's like your medical insurance premiums. You don't have to pay any tax on it, no payroll tax. Okay, so it has one big advantage in that it is pre-tax. So that's fantastic. Now, if you're over the Social Security limit, which kicks in the 130,000s range, then you don't save any Social Security, but you will still save Medicare. And if you're at the top tax bracket, Medicare will be about 2.35% on top of 37%, so about 40%, not including state if you're in state. So that's a big benefit. Now, we don't have a high deductible health plan. We use a FSA for healthcare reimbursement, but that is a use it or lose it thing. So we use that per year, and it's not an investment vehicle, which an HSA is. So an HSA, you can have your money in there, and you can use it to reimburse yourself for health expenses. However, you can also invest that money. Now, so one is pre-tax on the way in, so pre-tax. Then while it's in there, it does not get taxed, even though you can invest it. So that makes it similar to a regular tax sheltered retirement account. You don't pay any taxes while the money is inside. So that is the second level of tax protection. Okay. But people say it's triple tax benefited, and that's because on the way out, at any time, if it's used for healthcare expenses, you don't have to pay tax on it. Now, I could incur a medical expense today, let's say it's $1,000, and I could have money in my HSA that could reimburse myself that $1,000. I could just pay that out of my own pocket, keep that receipt, let that $1,000 in the HSA grow tax-free for 30 plus years, 40 years, 50 years, whatever, then reimburse myself that $1,000. In the meantime, all of those gains would still be in the account. So I don't have to do it at that particular time. There's no expiration date on when you can take those reimbursements to yourself. So it acts basically like, people call it a stealth IRA, because you're able to put the money in, it's able to grow tax-free. Okay. Now, when you take it out for healthcare expenses, it also comes out tax-free. So it's the only account that is pre-tax on the way in, tax-free while it's there, and tax-free on the way out at any age. So it is an amazing account, although it is relatively small. Okay. Now, there are a number of catches to this. Has to come out for qualified medical expenses. Otherwise, there's an additional 20% additional tax. This is in contrast to other retirement accounts where they charge you like another 10%. 20% is a pretty steep quote unquote penalty. Now, I say penalty in quotes because I hate that term penalty. It's just an additional tax. Every tax we pay is just another tax. They just increase it by 20%. If it goes in pre-tax and you're saving 40% on it, but then let's pretend I take it out and I decide to retire early at 50 and I don't have any medical expenses to use it on, then I would just pay 20% more than my marginal tax rate is. My marginal tax rate could be zero. So I could just be paying 20% on tax, 20% tax on it, which is still a big discount from the 40%. And it would have still grown pre-tax. And it avoided Medicare tax completely. Okay, because when you avoid Medicare on the way in, you never have to pay that Medicare tax. It's kind of like a cash balance pension or a 401k employer contribution. Those all bypass payroll taxes, Medicare in particular. So you don't have to pay that tax ever on those dollars. So there's a substantial arbitrage being the difference between the tax that you would have paid on the front end versus the tax you pay on the back end, like about 40% minus 20%. Now, let's pretend you take it out for a healthcare expense. You could take it out at any age. So it's an excellent way to tap into quote unquote retirement dollars if you're using it as a stealth IRA early, because you can save up those receipts and start using that to draw down from as an account if you retire early and you don't want to tap into any of the other accounts. Okay. Now, in contrast to an IRA where, for example, age 59 and a half or 62 in between an IRA and a 401k, they have different ages. When you get to those ages, you can start taking money out penalty free. This has a different age. This is actually 65 that is applicable. Then that applicability of age is not based on when you can take it out tax free, because you can take it out at any time for a medical expense. But at age 65, you can completely avoid that 20% penalty for non-qualified withdrawals. So once you become 65 years old, you can just start taking money from that as you would from a traditional IRA. You would just have to pay whatever your marginal tax rate is on those dollars. There are no RMDs, required minimum distributions, that would kick in at age 70 and a half. I think that might actually get changed it's not going to be 70 and a half in the future, but I think at the moment it's 70 and a half. So you don't have to worry about RMDs for an HSA. Now, the big catch to the HSA, and this is something that very few people ever talk about because the triple tax advantage is so incredible, albeit again, this is a small account, that we don't look at the downsides. The big downside is if the person whose account it is dies, and as Vera says, if it does not go to a spouse, it becomes not actually a taxable account. Sorry, it becomes taxable to the beneficiary. Okay, because there was no money that money has not been taxed. So corollary, let's pretend I have a traditional IRA that was pre-tax money going in, or a 401k that was pre-tax money going in. When I retire, I roll it all into an IRA, pre-tax, traditional IRA. Then when I die, I pass it on to a beneficiary, and that beneficiary, let's say a child, can stretch that out for 10 years and take withdrawals over 10 years so they don't have to pay all the tax all at once. Because having that big bolus of capital go into your account in 1 year will move you up the tax brackets very quickly if the beneficiary is not already at the top tax bracket. This is worse than that because you can't spread it out over 10 years. And it used to be able you could spread out for like ever, but the HSA you cannot spread out over more than 1 year. It is in the year that you receive it, boom, you have to pay tax on all of those dollars. So let's pretend this becomes $1 million. You pass it on to a child, they get $1 million of income that year, and that will be a lot of tax. Now, if you are saving the money when you're putting it in at the top tax bracket at like 40%, then as long as they're not paying more than 40% tax on it, then you still got out ahead. Okay, even if it's exactly the same tax rate, about 40% on the way in and 40% on the way out, you still had tax-free growth all along the way. And it's also protected because it's inside of an account. So you still have an advantage. So if you are at a high tax bracket, this is something that I would not be that worried about because you're saving it pre-tax. Now, if you are at a low marginal tax rate, if you're at 0, 10, or 12%, you need to be very careful about using an HSA. This applies to people, for example, if they're starting residency right out of medical school. I don't necessarily strongly recommend that people get an HSA their very first year as an intern because you're taking money out that you're not paying taxes on, but you wouldn't have really paid tax on it anyway. You're going to get to like the 10% tax bracket, and you could potentially have to take it out and pay 20% plus. And so it's a very strong recommendation to use one if you have access to it, if you're in the red zone of my tax graph and the 30% plus range. But if you're in the blue zone in the 10, 12% or 0%, then you need to be careful about what you choose to do, because there's not like a Roth HSA option. It's pre-tax money and it's pre-tax on the way out. Now, what can you do? So let's pretend you retire and you have multiple accounts. You have your HSA, you have a traditional IRA is pre-tax, you have a Roth IRA, which is post-tax Roth dollars, and you have your taxable account. Now, you have to think about what happens to the beneficiaries with each of these accounts. So a Roth IRA, they pay no tax on that, but they can't hold that forever. They will have to draw that out over 10 years. So there's no tax liability to the heir. For the traditional IRA, they are going to have to pay taxes on that, but they can spread that out over 10 years. A taxable account, all of that money gets a step up in basis, so they have no tax liability for that either. Only going forward will they have to pay dividends and capital gains, but all of those capital gains that you have not paid taxes on, that gets stepped up to in basis so that your heirs do not have to pay tax on all those gains. Those gains wash away. It's fantastic, which is why a taxable account is actually a very tax efficient account, because you can take advantage of a lot of things like tax loss harvesting and also the step up in basis. Now, your HSA is the only one that has a tax bomb associated with it. So first of all, if you have one, you should have your spouse be your beneficiary ideally, because they don't have to pay a tax bomb if you die. But when the spouse dies, the next heir would have to pay that tax bomb. Now, you have to look at what the tax brackets are of the beneficiaries, right? So let's pretend you have 2 children, and one of them is still in college and one of them is working. Okay. And one of the person who's working is making, let's say, $200,000. So that person's already in to an intermediate tax rate. But the other child who's still in college is paying like 0 tax. Okay. So if you have $100,000 or so go to that person who's not working, that's not going to be a lot of tax for that person to pay. It's not that big of a deal. Okay. And you may have multiple beneficiaries who have very low incomes. And so you can pass that tax bomb onto them, and it's not much of an issue because they have such limited tax liability. But you can also plan ahead and spend that account down in advance of other accounts. So you could deplete your HSA up until age 70, for example. Then when RMDs kick in, they start spending down your traditional IRA. monies, and then you just don't even touch your Roth IRA or taxable accounts. It just depends how big these accounts are. So you can try to spend down the HSA first just to minimize that tax bomb. But you can also save some of it because for healthcare expenses, you won't have to pay any tax on that at all. So it's a balance. It really depends how big it is. And what your healthcare expenses are. Healthcare is probably the biggest variable unknown-wise in terms of costs when you're in that phase of your life, in the non-working phase of your life. Those healthcare costs can be enormous. So you may want to protect that account. And if you can avoid paying tax on it completely and only take out dollars for healthcare expenses, then that could be ideal. So you could, for example, just take out money from the HSA for healthcare dollars, and then you could choose from traditional IRA, Roth IRA, or taxable accounts where you can take other dollars from. And you just have to kind of plot out how many more years or how many more expenses you're going to have and how big that account is in proportion to the other accounts. So you just kind of have to plan ahead for it. But ideally, on that HSA, you would never pay any tax on it if possible. And if you do have to pay tax on it, then you want it to be as low as possible. For example, less than 20% if you can. Like in that 0 to 12% range would be a great place for that money to get taxed at, ideally if it's you paying it or a beneficiary receiving it. But at the moment, there aren't ways that you can just avoid taxation if passing it down to a beneficiary who is not the spouse. That's really the only one drawback to an HSA. But if you have access to it, I would still definitely do it if you're at that high tax bracket range. I have some people who often ask me, because the benefits of the HSA are so good, should I switch to a high deductible health plan? And if you're making a lot of money, this HSA really is small potatoes. And so you have to really look at the costs, medical cost wise, especially if you have kids or if you have somebody in your family who's of childbearing age. There are all sorts of medical expenses that can come up, and choosing a plan that might not cover you as well because you're trying to get an HSA might not be the best thing to do with your money. There's a lot of other ways to save money in tax, for example, using an FSA account and using all your other retirement accounts. And really, I haven't talked much about it, but a cash balance plan, if you can get one open, is going to blow away the benefits of basically every other account you have access to beyond like a 401k. All right. So that is it for our Saturday night episode on HSAs. Until tomorrow, when we get to episode number, are we out to number 63 already? Wow. We have done 34 episodes in the past like 33 days. All right. Thank you for everybody joining. What if they are twins? Yeah, if they are twins, one of them might be in college and one of them might not be in college. You never know. All right. Have a good night.